Print, email, Facebook, Twitter. More. Did the US presidential limousine in which JFK was shot come to Australia? The assassination of US President John F. Kennedy was one of the defining moments of the 20th century, but it happened 14,000 kilometers away in Dallas, Texas. Surely there's no connection to Australia. Well, curious Melburnian Gideon Cullican thinks there may be. He's been fascinated by the event since looking through the old newspapers his parents had kept from the momentous day in November 1963. The conspiracy theories fascinated me, Mr. Cullican said. But also, how could you lose a president that way in broad daylight? That's a question well outside the scope of Curious Melbourne. But Mr. Cullican had another question that had a definite local focus. Did the famous Kennedy limousine come to Australia after the president was shot? Surely not. JFK's limousine in 1961, a short time into Kennedy's presidency. The White House leased a specially modified Lincoln convertible built by the Ford Motor Company. The vehicle, codenamed the SS-100X by the U.S. Secret Service, came with added extras such as telephones, a retractable roof, flashing lights, standing platforms for security agents and, questionably, in hindsight, a hydraulic lift that raised the president's seat so that he could be more easily seen. It was by far the most expensive and sophisticated car built for a president, but, impressive as it was, the SS-100X did not have the armor plating and bulletproof glass that would soon become standard for presidential limousines. The Kennedy limousine is one of the most famous vehicles in history, with countless documentaries, films and books devoted to what happened to its most famous passenger in 1963. Photos and vision of the limousine on the day have been examined, dissected, discussed and disputed for decades, but many people do not know what happened to the vehicle in the years that followed. A second chance after the assassination, and still covered in blood, the SS-100X was flown from Dallas back to Washington, D.C., where it was stored in the White House garage and searched for evidence by the FBI. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president and one of the biggest criminal investigations in history began. It would have been well down his list of priorities given the recent events, but the new president found himself without an official limousine, certainly without one that met appropriate security standards given the events in Dallas. Matt Anderson, transport curator at the Henry Ford Museum, explained to Curious Melbourne what happened next. People assumed that the car was either destroyed or locked away in a warehouse somewhere, he said. It was a simple matter of expediency. The president needed a parade car, and it was much faster to rebuild the existing car than to build something from scratch. So, the decision was made to refit the SS-100X. This was considered the quickest and the most cost-effective solution, earning it the nickname the Quick Fix. The vehicle was sent to the Hess and Eisenhardt Company, which specialized in making armored vehicles, and was stripped back to its bare bones before being modified. Titanium plating was added to the body, along with a bulletproof roof and windows, and flat-proof tires. It was also fitted with an air filtration system to protect against chemical attack. But President Johnson was not happy with the finished product, Mr. Anderson said. The limo retained its midnight blue paint, he said. Johnson took one look and ordered that the car be repainted in black. He thought the blue was too associated with President Kennedy and the assassination. After a repaint, the limousine was returned to the White House in May 1964, 6 months after JFK's assassination. President Johnson was said to have been extremely uncomfortable about riding in the infamous limousine, for obvious reasons, but used it as his official car until 1968. What does this have to do with Melbourne? Okay, I'm coming to that. While serving as president, Lyndon B. Johnson twice traveled to Australia. His first visit, in 1966, was primarily to thank Australia for supporting the war in Vietnam. In Australia, President Johnson traveled in, yes, you guessed it, the SS-100X, Kennedy's limousine. Researchers at the Henry Ford Museum confirmed to Curious Melbourne that the limo did, in fact, come all the way with LBJ, Boom Tish, GIF, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson visits Melbourne. Play GIF 20.6 MB settings. Johnson's first visit to Australia sent crowds into a frenzy. A sitting U.S. president had never before visited the country, and just about everyone was keen to see what the fuss was about. In Sydney, the crowd greeting Johnson was estimated at around 1 million people, and at one stage during the president's drive through the city, streamers clogged the limousine's front grille, causing the air conditioning to shut down. There were protesters too, hundreds of them, expressing discontent about America and Australia's involvement in the war in Vietnam, where President's motorcade was stopped by demonstrators lying on the road. Then NSW Premier Robert Uskin, who was riding in the SS-100X with Johnson and Harold Holt, famously quipped, "Run the bastards over." A colourful Melbourne welcome before visiting Sydney. The president stopped off in Victoria, home to then Prime Minister Harold Holt, with whom Johnson had developed a strong bond. Protests in Melbourne were smaller than later efforts in Sydney, but arguably made a greater impression on the president and certainly a more lasting impression on his limousine. 18 people were arrested and charged after the president's visit to Melbourne, for offences ranging from indecent language, public intoxication and assault with a weapon. An egg. The actions of two brothers, aged 19 and 21, attracted worldwide attention. GIF: paint bombs are thrown at Lyndon B. Johnson's limousine. Play GIF 18.3 MB settings. As the president's motorcade passed through South Yarra, David and John Langley threw plastic bags full of coloured paint on the SS-100X. The brothers were charged with throwing a missile and released after 14 days. Not before one of them had to sit some university exams in prison. The shirt worn by one of the Secret Service agents guarding the president is now held by the Melbourne Museum, still splattered in green paint. The result of the protest left the president's minders with a major headache. The paint thrown on the limousine had started to dry and couldn't be removed by hand. Johnson was due to visit Sydney the next day for the showpiece event of his visit, and driving through the city in a car splattered with paint simply would not do. So, the vehicle was rushed to the Ford factory in Broadmeadows, where it was hoped workers would have more luck restoring the paintwork. Under extreme time pressure, Ford workers decided to strip and repaint the limousine rather than retouch the damaged areas. They completed the job in an hour, in time for the car to be flown to Sydney by the US Air Force. What happened to the limousine? The SS-100X clocked up tens of thousands of kilometers on the road in the service of the White House, and even more air miles on many overseas trips. But, even when Johnson commissioned a new limousine, which came into service in 1968, that was not the end of road for the iconic car, as Matt Anderson from the Henry Ford Museum explained. The vehicle stayed in service at the White House until the late 1970s and, although no longer the main presidential limousine, was occasionally used by Presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. People are surprised to learn that it was rebuilt and used for another 14 years following the Kennedy assassination, Mr. Anderson said. People assume that the car was either destroyed or locked away in a warehouse somewhere. After the White House stopped leasing the SS-100X in 1978, it was returned to the Ford Motor Company and now sits in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. No doubt it's been repainted many times since 1966, but it's tempting to think that somewhere under the gloss, some of the handiwork of the Ford workers at Brodie might still be there. Who asked the question? Gideon Cullican has been fascinated by John F. Kennedy and his assassination since finding his parents' newspaper collection from the 1960s. He wanted to know if it was true that Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, traveled in the infamous Kennedy limousine when he visited Melbourne in 1966 and 1967. Do you have a question for Curious Melbourne? *0/140. Your contact info will be in touch if we look into your question. Name, email address, phone number. Optional. Please don't publish my name. Submit. Powered by Hark and Print. Email, Facebook, Twitter.